Tantor Audio presents The Triumph and Tragedy of Lyndon Johnson, The White House Years, by Joseph A. Califano, Jr., narrated by Norman Dietz. Introduction. We are living in Lyndon Johnson's America. Love him or loathe him, it is widely recognized that Lyndon Johnson was a president who knew how to make Washington work, even among those who didn't like how he made it work and what he made it work on. It is now considered a major accomplishment for a president to pass one or a few major bills over a 4 or 8 year term. Welfare reform for Bill Clinton, No Child Left Behind for George W. Bush, affordable care for Barack Obama. Between 1964 and 1969, President Johnson submitted, and the 88th, 89th, and 90th Congresses enacted hundreds of legislative initiatives in education, health care, environmental and consumer protection, civil rights, immigration reform, housing and urban affairs, the arts and humanities, criminal justice, and many other areas. Those great society laws and policies not only continue to shape our nation, they also fuel its public controversies and form the subject matter of our public policy dialogue to this day. Today, many, perhaps most, citizens doubt that Washington can work at all. They oscillate between despair and cynicism about a nation's capital paralyzed by partisan politics, dominated by special interests, tied in knots by Lilliputian lobbyists, and driven by polls, with the President and the House and Senate devoting inordinate attention to raising money for the next election. Against this worrisome backdrop, the history of Lyndon Johnson's years offers a remarkable tale of triumph. His administration oversaw an extraordinary advance of progressive government, despite the tragedy of the Vietnam War, and it achieved striking success despite the frightening turbulence and violence that accompanied the civil rights movement, anti-war protests, and roiling cultural revolutions in sexual conduct and drug use. Indeed, we are living in Lyndon Johnson's America. In these early years of the 21st century, his Great Society programs continue to touch the life of every American more than the programs of any other president, from conception to death, from urban center to rural outpost, from east to west and north to south, in schools and colleges, in community health clinics and great medical centers, even in the air we breathe and the water we drink. His initiatives affect the theater, opera, and dance companies we patronize, the public television we watch, and the public radio we listen to. He wrought changes that altered what happens in voting booths, jury rooms, and immigration offices. His consumer laws influence how most of the food we eat and products we buy are produced and marketed. The social revolution he sired, and the national government he shaped, still top the charts for political hailing and haranguing in the nation's capital, state legislatures, city councils, and town halls. Whatever one's view of Lyndon Johnson, the impact of his Great Society has been, and for many years is likely to continue, to be penetrating and pervasive. This book is about how this infernally complex, driven, and driving president, a man of deep personal insecurities and dizzying mood swings, did it. How he mastered the bone-crushing politics of civil rights and anti-poverty wars. How he used every waking minute of his presidency and every lever of power, sometimes brushing aside traditional separation of powers. How he mixed arguments, flattery, favors, and veiled and not-so-veiled threats to persuade congressional, business, labor, education, health care, and religious leaders to support his proposals, or at least accept them, however grudgingly. This is the story of how LBJ stepped around or over those who opposed him, sometimes using tactics that would make Machiavelli blush. It is a story of how he did it all with laser-like focus on completing the work that Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman left unfinished, and with the goal of achieving a largely peaceful social and economic revolution. This is also, as accurately as I can tell it, a personal story of one of the most compelling and controversial and perhaps the most complicated presidents this nation has ever seen. Historians will study, analyze, and debate Lyndon Johnson for decades to come. While we await their work, I have written to provide what historians often lack in trying to assess earlier presidents: an eyewitness account, a real-time close-up of a president's world from someone who lived and worked in his presence almost 24/7 for several exhilarating, exhausting, and often exasperating years. With the recent release of the Johnson tapes, the smash hit play All the Way on Broadway starring Bryan Cranston as LBJ, and numerous 50th anniversary commemorations and critiques of the Great Society programs in the media, Americans are coming to appreciate that Johnson's initiatives are so entwined with their lives that, as the Washington Post reported, it's hard to imagine the country as we know it without them. So now, with a half-century of hindsight, it's time to re-examine the accomplishments of this mercurial, hyperkinetic chief executive. In this new introduction to my 1991 memoir of my years in the Johnson White House, I'll first review the vast scope of the Great Society legislation, programs that touch and improve the lives of every American today. Then I'll discuss some of the ways Johnson marshaled the power to realize his social and economic revolution. Who knows? Perhaps Johnson's path will one day serve as a roadmap for current and future leaders. The Great Society Today. For the past half a century, the tragedy of Vietnam has so clouded the public and scholarly vision of Lyndon Johnson that it has been difficult to see what his domestic achievements actually mean for America. That disastrous war, coupled with a fear of being called liberal as the country became more conservative, has led leaders of his own Democratic Party, even some compatriots who voted for his Great Society programs, to relegate Lyndon Johnson to near invisibility for much of the past 50 years. Many recent Democratic leaders have avoided mentioning his name in their speeches, political campaigns, and conventions. That silence has given LBJ's conservative critics an open field to score repeatedly with unanswered denunciations. Moreover, LBJ was a force of nature, with seemingly 1,000 faces, a big-eared Texan calloused by growing up in the raw poverty of the hill country with no running water or electricity. He was a politician who literally went nose to nose to overwhelm someone he was trying to convince, a great storyteller with a raucous sense of humor. All that made him an unforgettable character, but one ready-made for caricature rather than portraiture, not only by political cartoonists, but also by political reporters and television commentators. But the release of hundreds of hours of his taped conversations reveal a shrewd, adept, and committed president. And now, at the half-century mark, his oft-derided Great Society programs are still flourishing, many of them expanded by his successors. A new look at the hundreds of laws he put in place and how they've changed our country and everyday lives is prompting a reevaluation of not only his presidency, but also his personality, as well as a recognition of his enduring influence. The programs he hammered into the legislative steel of our democracy have survived his painful war. But the fallout of that war will always hover over his presidency with endless what-ifs and how much furthers his great society programs might have reduced poverty, increased opportunity, or extended the penetration of the federal government into our lives had there been no Vietnam. Piercing through the fog of that war, the nation has begun to recognize how this intense, inspiring, and infuriating leader of vast ambition for his country and for himself made government work and etched so many indelible marks on our world. Lyndon Johnson may well be the strongest link in the great chain of the nation's progressive traditions, certainly up there with Theodore and Franklin Roosevelt, as he made seemingly impossible dreams of progressives come true, and then some. Even harsh critics have acknowledged his significance in progressive history. South Dakota Senator George McGovern, Lyndon Johnson's bitterest opponent on the Vietnam War, declared to a 2012 gathering, "With the exception of FDR, who had 4 terms in the White House, LBJ was the greatest president of the 20th century." McGovern affirmed that LBJ made a terrible mistake on the Vietnam War, but noted that the historical records show that Johnson inherited it and wanted no part of it. He just didn't know how to get it off his back. John Kenneth Galbraith, another stinging critic of Johnson on Vietnam, said nonetheless of his presidency, "The initiatives of Lyndon Johnson on civil rights, voting rights, and on economic and social deprivation must no longer be enshrouded by that war." Consider LBJ's education laws, which marked the first real entry of the federal government into education since the Morrill Land-Grant College Act in Lincoln's time. Head Start serves some 1 million preschool children a year. The 1965 Elementary and Secondary Education Act provides resources to more than 56,000 lower, middle, and high schools in every state. The same law supports bilingual education programs for immigrants in more than 70 languages and special education for handicapped children and those with learning disabilities. LBJ's Higher Education Acts opened college and the consequent economic opportunities to anyone with the brains and ambition to go there. 2/3 of college students take advantage of the loan, grant, and work-study programs established in those laws and their progeny. In health and medicine, LBJ's landmark Medicare provides health care for 52 million senior and disabled Americans and Medicaid for 66 million low-income patients, thus improving the quality of their lives and relieving them and their families of the burden and anxiety of wondering how or if they can afford necessary treatment. These initiatives pay the bill for 2/3 of the elderly living in nursing homes. Some 9,000 community health centers provide access to health care for millions of needy individuals. Heart, Cancer, and Stroke Act programs have established citadels of medical excellence in cities across the country. Health professions legislation has provided funds to increase the number of doctors, nurses, and other health professionals. LBJ's food stamp program, today called SNAP, Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program, helps feed more than 40 million poor families. His school breakfast program, started in 1966, today improves health and attendance and grades of 10 million children in more than 89,000 schools and preschools. The Immigration Reform Act of 1965 shapes America's demography in the 21st century. by scrapping the shameful restrictive quotas of the National Origins Act of 1924 that favored white Western Europeans. That law gave universal meaning to the Statue of Liberty's welcoming words, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to be free." It opened our gates to millions of Mexicans, Central and South Americans, Asians, Africans, and Southern and Eastern Europeans, creating the most multicultural nation in world history. From the early 1960s until 2012, the percentages of legal immigrants from Latin America climbed from 9 to 53%. From Asia up from 5 to 28%, and from Africa and other places up from 1 to 5%, while the percentage of immigrants from Northern Europe and Canada dropped from 85 to 14%. Often regarded as the signature achievements of LBJ's years in office, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Voting Rights Act of 1965, and Fair Housing Act of 1968 opened up a new world for blacks and other minorities. The lasting reach of anti-discrimination measures also includes women, added in the House to the 1964 Act. Great Society bail reform and fair jury legislation influence federal and state criminal justice systems. Robert Caro, LBJ's most meticulous and demanding biographer, concludes that, with the single exception of Lincoln, he, Johnson, was the greatest champion with a white skin that they, all Americans of color, had in the history of the Republic. He was the lawmaker for the poor and the downtrodden and the oppressed, the president who wrote mercy and justice into the statute books by which America was governed. It's difficult to overstate the changes those laws have wrought. Take just voting rights. When enacted, there were 5 black members in the House of Representatives and 1 in the Senate. By 2014, there were 43 in the House, 3 in the Senate, and a president in the White House. In 1964, there were 300 black elected officials in the nation. In 2014, there were more than 11,000 blacks elected to state legislatures, city and county offices, law enforcement, and education posts. And in 2014 in Mississippi, it was the African American vote that saved incumbent Senate Republican Thad Cochran. Beyond legislation, in the 1965 Howard University commencement address, LBJ unfolded one of his most contentious initiatives, which to this day scratches like a fingernail on the blackboard and splits the Supreme Court. Freedom is not enough. You do not take a person who, for years, has been hobbled by chains and liberate him, bring him up to the starting line of a race and say, "You are free to compete with all the others," and still justly believe that you have been completely fair. This is the next and the more profound stage of the battle for civil rights. Thus was born the concept of affirmative action, Johnson's conviction that it was essential as a matter of social justice to provide the tutoring, the extra help, even the occasional preference, if necessary, to those who had suffered 300 years of discrimination in order to give them a fair chance to share in the American dream. Less known and largely ignored at the time was Johnson's similar campaign to place women in top government positions. The White House telephone tapes reveal him hectoring cabinet officers to appoint women to top jobs. Historian Patricia Zellman, in her book Women, Work, and National Policy, The Kennedy-Johnson Years, credits Johnson with creating an affirmative action reporting system for women, surely the first of its kind in the White House. LBJ proposed legislation to provide equal opportunity in promotions for women in the armed forces. Signing the bill in 1967, Johnson noted, "There is no reason why we should not someday have a female chief of staff, or even a female commander-in-chief. We now have a number of female generals and admirals, and waiting in the wings a potential female commander-in-chief." Though rarely acknowledged as such, LBJ is arguably the patriarch of our contemporary environmental movement, as Theodore Roosevelt was of an earlier environmental crusade. LBJ put plenty of laws on the books: Clean Air, Water Quality, and Clean Water Restoration Acts and Amendments, Solid Waste Disposal Act, Motor Vehicle Pollution Control Act, Aircraft Noise Abatement Act, and Highway Beautification Act. The 1968 Wild and Scenic Rivers Act protects more than 200 rivers in 38 states. The 1968 Trail System Act established more than 1,200 recreation, scenic, and historic trails covering 54,000 miles. These laws are critical to the quality of the water we drink and swim in, the air we breathe, and the trails we hike. Even more sweeping than those laws is LBJ's articulation of the underlying principle for a new conservation that inspires both today's environmentalists and the opponents who resist their efforts. The air we breathe, our water, our soil, and wildlife are being blighted by the poisons and chemicals which are the byproducts of technology and industry. The same society which receives the rewards of technology must, as a cooperating whole, take responsibility for control. To deal with these new problems will require a new conservation. We must not only protect the countryside and save it from destruction, we must restore what has been destroyed and salvage the beauty and charm of our cities. LBJ's environmental commandment, that there is an obligation to restore as well as preserve, and that those who reap the reward of modern technology must also pay the price of their industrial pollution, not only sparked his spate of environmental laws, but also provided the rationale for later laws creating the Environmental Protection Agency and the Superfund. LBJ's revolution affected urban America as well. His urban mass transit legislation gave San Franciscans BART, Washingtonians the Metro, Atlantans MARTA, and cities across the country thousands of buses and modernized transit systems. The 1968 Housing and Urban Development Act still helps finance housing, including homeownership for millions of families. Johnson's much maligned war on poverty was effective and continues to this day. During his term in office, the poverty rate dropped from 20 to 12%. Today, Medicare and the increase in the minimum Social Security benefit that he drove through Congress are largely responsible for pushing the poverty rate among seniors down to 9% in 2012, from 35% in 1960. 11 of 12 programs begun in LBJ's Office of Economic Opportunity still operate. Lyndon Johnson is hardly considered a champion of the arts and media. Yet among his lasting contributions are the Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts, the Hirshhorn Museum and Sculpture Garden, the Renwick Gallery, taken over by the Smithsonian in 1967, the American Film Institute, founded in 1967, and the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, enacted in 1968. Johnson established the National Endowments for the Arts and Humanities, which were designed to bring music, drama, literature, and the visual arts to even remote hamlets. The endowments have helped found or support some 1,800 theater companies, 800 non-profit symphony orchestras and chamber groups, 440 dance companies, and 140 opera companies in every state. In 1967, LBJ proposed and convinced Congress to establish the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which has spawned 350 public television stations and 897 public radio stations that millions view and listen to each day. And how much more transparent is government because of the Freedom of Information Act he signed in 1966, which has enabled reporters and public interest groups to obtain documents that executive branch officials would prefer to keep secret. As Pulitzer Prize-winning art and architecture critic of the Washington Post, Philip Kennicott, put it, Johnson did something unprecedented in American history. He put art, culture, and beauty on the same footing as roads, rights, commerce, and security. The calculated brilliance of the Johnson cultural legacy is how closely it mirrors his other legislative priorities. LBJ's presidential years bridged the vast morphing of the nation's commercial life from corner grocers, local banks, neighborhood pharmacists, and small retailers to supermarkets, national food producers, international financial institutions, and gigantic drug and department store chains, as well as the emergence of huge corporations like auto companies and manufacturers of home appliances. To help harried individuals cope with this new world of complex agreements and cleverly designed and marketed products, LBJ put in place a wide range of consumer protection measures that we take for granted today: truth in securities, truth in packaging, child safety, highway and auto safety, tire safety, mine safety, flammable fabrics, Product Safety Commission, the National Transportation Safety Board, truth in lending, wholesome meat, wholesome poultry, and wholesome fish laws. Whether one applauds or attacks the Great Society, when Lyndon Johnson left the government in 1969, it was a political, institutional, economic, and social reality. Its programs are woven into the fabric of our lives and esteemed by most citizens, even though few know their origin. Johnson certainly enlarged the scope of government. He inherited a federal bureaucracy that operated fewer than 50 domestic programs. His legacy was one of operating some 500 such programs. Today's federal government is deeply involved in education at every level, bringing to the country a more complete national health insurance system, continuing to enforce voting and other opportunities for minorities, providing economic assistance for the poor and a critical source of cash maintenance for millions of older and other citizens, and regulating national corporations and state and local governments as they provide financial, transportation, environmental, and social services. With such wide-ranging changes in our laws and social programs, inevitably come problems. So along with his vast legacy of legislative changes, Lyndon Johnson has left another legacy: unremitting controversy. Among the most trenchant topics of debate are how much government is too much government, and whether the Great Society legislation has centralized too much power in the executive and legislative branches in Washington. Lyndon Johnson certainly meant to tilt the balance of power to the White House, not only vis-a-vis the other branches of the federal government, but also vis-a-vis the states, cities, and counties. He saw his shift as essential in order to deal with the hard rock of resistance to his civil rights and anti-poverty measures, and, of course, it fit nicely with his personal penchant for power. In fact, his Great Society programs have also enhanced the power of Congress, something he likely would have regarded as collateral damage. Thus, A lasting legacy is that not just the presidency, but that Congress as well has become, for good or for ill, a locus of power, displacing somewhat the states, cities, and institutions whose relative power has declined. As a result, the failures of the President and the Congress loom larger because their powers and our expectations.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?